Now, Chief Economist at Econometrix Azar Jammine says the latest rate hike will hurt indebted consumers, but says the current rates are not too different from the levels prior to the COVID pandemic. His comments follow the Reserve Bank's decision to increase the repurchase rate to 6.25% and the bank's prime lending rate to 9.57%. Yesterday, Dr. Azar Jammine joins us now via Zoom. A very good morning to you. This decision just coming on the eve of that announcement by Stats SA that the annual CPI inflation has edged lower in August to 7.6%. Clearly, this didn't help.
Well, the fact that the inflation rate came down and also the Reserve Bank's own inflation forecasts were revised downwards, especially for next year, from 5.7 down to 5.3%. Clearly, these were not sufficient factors to stop the Reserve Bank from raising interest rates. It's quite clear that there were two other factors that persuaded the Reserve Bank to hike rates. The first was the international environment, where all central banks are in the process of or most central banks are in the process of raising interest rates. And in fact, the day before the MPC decision, the US Federal Reserve Board increased its basic interest rates by 0.75%. And the Reserve Bank is obviously keen to maintain a differential between the interest rates that are available on rand assets and those available on dollar assets, so that there is some attraction into putting money into rand-denominated assets. And we saw this in the fact that the rand appreciated against the dollar after the Reserve Bank's decision. And the second factor that must have weighed on the Reserve Bank is the fact that the Bureau for Economic Research's Inflation Expectation Survey showed a fairly significant increase in expectations of what inflation was going to do by the ordinary man in the street. And so the Reserve Bank clearly wanted to knock those expectations on the head by raising interest rates so sharply.
What are your thoughts about the sentiment that South Africa's problems are not so much the consumer price inflation, but inflation caused by the administered costs in the country, such as the fuel levies, for argument's sake? Is there any merit to that?
Without a doubt, yeah, without a doubt. And I wouldn't just say the fuel levies, because fuel prices have risen not because of fuel levies, but because oil prices have risen. But there are many other elements of administered prices that are contributing towards sustained high inflation. Property rates and taxes by municipalities are really draining the average household homeowner. You've got electricity tariffs that are obviously increasing all the time by far more than inflation. And you've got medical aid costs and education costs also rising by much more than inflation. And similar other things like the fuel pipeline costs, those are also rising much more than inflation. There are many of these government-induced contributors towards higher inflation, because in the private sector, times are so tough that businesses are finding it extremely difficult to pass on cost increases to consumers. You see this in the fact that home rentals are rising by no more than 2%. So that gives you an idea of what is happening.
So what recourse do South African consumers have in these trying times? Is there any breathing space for them?
There is a breathing space being provided by the fact that there have been indications that consumers are resorting to borrowing money at an increasing rate in recent times to make up for the fact that their disposable income is not keeping pace with inflation. In the short term, this is beneficial because it's preventing retail sales and consumer spending from collapsing the way, or from declining far more steeply than might have been the case. But clearly, it can't go on in the longer term, because if it carries on indefinitely, then people will start carrying an unacceptable level of personal debt. but we're nowhere near that position yet at the moment.
Another big story of the week, that announcement by the Department of Minerals and Energy Affairs that the signing on 3 independent power producers in the wind energy production space. Your thoughts about that development?
Yes, I think that the contribution of government's policy towards allowing independent power producers to start generating electricity more effectively than they have been allowed to in the past, where licensing requirements prohibited such action, is to be greatly welcomed and really is the only alternative solution now to the load shedding crisis that we have. So one can only welcome this move, but unfortunately, what one must also ask, why has it taken so long for government to actually come to the party with allowing such action to be taken? There's been this obsession, ideological obsession, with not allowing the private sector to get into electricity generation and distribution.
Dr. Azar Jammine, thank you for your time this morning. Mr. Jammine is the Chief Economist at Econometrix.